continuing with the question of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, reminding ourselves that the P here is price level, the Y here is output level, macroeconomic concepts, and even though I'm using words like supply and demand, aggregate supply is different than supply in a single market. Aggregate demand is different than demand in a single market. What lies behind these two is very different. And that for us to make sense of these curves, we actually have to begin the story somewhere. We have to begin, and this is very different than what happens when you use these curves elsewhere. We have to begin at a particular moment. And we're going to call that moment equilibrium, but that's not what we mean. It just means starting point. Price one, output level one. This is price level. This is output level. And the shapes of these curves depend on where we are in relation to full employment and what's happening with policy and what's happening in the world and so on. We went through the impact of something changing C plus I plus G plus X minus M, which was what lies behind aggregate demand. Let's look at the story of what happens if something changes. Now listen to this. Generalized input costs. Because the shape of this supply curve is sticky wages, but sticky wages is not the only major input cost that can affect you. Not every input cost can affect you. I mean, if somebody changes the price of sewing needles, it might change something happening in the textile industry. It's not going to affect this. But there are a few types of inputs that really, their cost structure affects aggregate supply, especially if their pricing is sticky or takes some time to adjust to or is unexpected and so on. And wages is the biggest one. That's why we did sticky wages. But the other one, many of you have heard of this, is oil, fuel. Our production structure lies behind that aggregate supply curve, which is not surprising because the shape of this aggregate supply curve depends on what's happening with my PPF, my production possibility frontier, and how close I am to its edge. So changes in technology can dramatically shift things. Current structure of production can dramatically shift things. And so when you think of production, think now of things that don't affect an individual industry, but affect industry generally. Macro, not micro. Oil costs will not affect a single industry. It won't just affect the oil industry. It will affect everything. It might affect your personal costs with the cost of oil at the pump. But it's going to affect all kinds of other things. It's going to affect the cost of transporting goods to your house. It's going to affect the shipping industry, which is going to affect global supply chain. So energy costs, oil costs, fuel costs, they act a little bit the way labor does. Yeah, it's going to affect every industry, not just one. A few other places, there's some concerns about whether AI, artificial intelligence, is going to change our supply curves and our supply chains enough that it will affect labor. And if it does, then it will affect every single industry, not just one. So we're looking for things, oil, AI, wages, things that are generalized, transportation, This one. People are really worried right now about how they are going to ship your basic supply chains between difficulties at the Panama Canal and now difficulties at the Suez Canal. So Panama and Suez were these two major transportation routes where ships would come through to transport products. If those shut, we're back. Well, not quite back, but we're in a bad situation for transportation. Similarly, ages ago under colonialism, some of the biggest things they did was the Suez Canal and the Suez Crisis, the laying down of cable, transcontinental railways, right? So these are the things I have in mind when I'm thinking of the supply side. I'm not thinking of teeny tiny things in an individual industry, like what's happening to your local pizza parlor. I'm thinking about this. It's going to affect everyone. Sometimes these are affected through political institutions. OPEC created an oil shock. Right? Sometimes it's created by natural disasters. So, for example, we've been really worried that natural disasters around, for example, Iceland, where they had this massive volcanic eruption 5-7 years ago, it shut down flight routes. You couldn't fly across the top of the world because there was no visibility. We're worried about how global climate change will shut down ports. They're worried about whether and how deforestation will shut down entire mineral industries that are basic to tons and tons and tons of production. Ecological crisis, transportation, global networks. Those are the things that can really shift this. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. I'm going to start with the oil shock. This is the classic example. If something happens to really increase costs until the markets can adjust. So think about this. Until we actually fully adjust to a post-oil, post-fuel, sustainable environmental world, everybody is frightened. We want it because we know it's a problem, but we're also terrified about how to pay for it, right? If you get, OPEC did this in the 70s, if you get a cost shock, in the short run, your supply curve will shift in. So on the supply, if on the demand side it was government policies or things like global recession, debt crisis and so on that was shifting AD, on the supply side it is cost shocks, and we call them shocks. Pop, shock. They shift that curve in and out. Technological change can shift short-run curve out. It can also shift the long-run final PPF level and full employment out. But that takes time. And in the interim, you have to manage it. In the short run, someone has to absorb the costs. And between cost shocks and natural disasters, boop, when you get a sudden shock, something that hits the economy and it spreads through your production side, your aggregate supply curve will shift in. And when that happens, look at what's happening. Your overall price level will go up at the same time that your output level and therefore your employment level will shut down. This is called stagflation. Because when the shift is on the demand side, we saw that prices went up as output went up. Prices came down as output came down, right? Cost shocks. Stagflation is a supply side problem, which means you have simultaneous increase in prices, inflation, and shutdown of production, which means you are also firing people. This is interesting. Both things are bad at the same time. And now here is where it gets really difficult. I know what I can do to fix C plus I plus G plus X minus M, the thing I taught you about with fiscal and monetary policy. That works through the demand side. Unless I engage in direct control of firm production, all my policy, because I'm trying to support the business sector, right? Remember all the way back I said this is moderate policy, this is not radical communist policy. I'm trying to support the business sector. What that means is all my policies are working through the demand side, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Support business through promoting investment. Support households by supporting consumption. Support military by supporting G. Support globalization by supporting X minus M, right? Everything is working through the demand side. Nobody is controlling firms. In our classic model, I got a problem. If I want to tackle inflation, I will have to push that price down by forcing a recession, by cutting back C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Only way I can do it. Push those wages down. Make it cheaper for businesses. Force households to accept lower wages, right? Or if I want to help expand output, then I can support households. I can push up wages. I can increase income. And the moment I do that, firms will say their profits are hurting. Right? So what you're seeing, this is why we think Keynesianism is a really good model, but that's also why a lot of us understand it as a moderate model. It's based on supporting businesses, and it works for cyclical unemployment. And it works for regular booms and busts. When it comes to cost shocks, structural problems, natural disasters, wage inequality, you got a whole different ballgame on your hands. Because now, either you can tackle inflation to support the firms, in which case you will hurt workers and households, or you can tackle income and unemployment, help the households, get them to spend more, give them jobs, you will hurt the firms. So the cost shocks of the 70s really placed on the table something we had forgotten. There is a trade-off. There is a political choice here. It is political. So which politics you choose is yours, but make no mistake. There is no answer that can solve everything. So if you want to understand the current debate about the soft landing, it's a very interesting one. When you look at the data, it turns out people were terrified of inflation, but it never happened. We came out of COVID, we were in a recession, the economy started heating up, the Fed said, inflation. Then they looked at the data and they found that didn't happen. The markets adjusted, and the Fed has just decided This is right now. At the end of 2023, the Fed has decided not to raise interest rates. But this is a debate. There are some people who are like, no. Proactively, the Fed needs to make sure that we raise interest rates so that we tackle inflation. Other people are saying, look, we just got out of COVID. We just got out of COVID. People are hurting. Finally, families are earning an income. We aren't seeing inflation. Why do you want to raise the interest rate? Why do you want to enforce a recession and push down wages when you're not seeing a problem? Wait for the problem. If the problem comes, then maybe you can solve it. But why are you doing this? So this is a political debate. Some people think that we need to proactively tackle inflation. Some people think we are just recovering from COVID and finally people have jobs and finally people are buying houses. Can we just wait before we solve a problem we don't have? So these are political questions which lie behind this graph. So this is the final point I want to remind you. Economists, we are storytellers. Our graphs help us tell the story. It helps us understand our options. But none of us pretend that we are physicists, that our graphs solve the world. What our graphs do is they tell you here are your options. Inflation, unemployment. What do you want to address? I can tell you your options, but which one you want to solve, that is your political decision.